What happens when Hollywood's most fearless talk show host goes head-to-head with one of its most outspoken stars over the most controversial topics of our time? You won't believe what unfolds when Emma Watson sits down with Bill Maher for what was supposed to be a standard celebrity interview, but quickly spirals into one of the most explosive confrontations in late-night television history. Tonight's episode delivered drama that nobody saw coming, with tensions escalating to a breaking point that left audiences stunned and one guest storming off the set in fury. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below because you're not going to believe what unfolds. The atmosphere in the studio was electric as Emma Watson made her entrance, waving to the audience with that familiar, intelligent smile. Bill Maher, ever the gracious host, stood to greet her with a firm handshake and his trademark grin. The crowd erupted in applause as Watson settled into the guest chair, adjusting her blazer and flashing that charming smile that had won over millions worldwide. But beneath the surface pleasantries, something felt different tonight. Maher's eyes held a glint of mischief, and those who knew him well could sense he was ready to pounce. "Emma Watson, welcome to Real Time," Maher began, his voice carrying that familiar blend of warmth and barely contained irreverence. "I have to say, it's not every day we get a UN Women Goodwill Ambassador on the show. Though I suppose in America we're all about celebrity saviors, right?" The audience chuckled, but Emma's smile flickered for just a moment. "Well, Bill, I think you'll find I'm not exactly your typical celebrity these days," she replied, her British accent crisp and confident. "I've been trying to find my own way, as they say." Maher leaned back in his chair, already sensing an opening. "Your own way? Sure, but let's talk about the Hollywood nightmare you've been so vocal about. All this public drama, the impassioned speeches, the feminist book club. It's like watching a very expensive after-school special, except the actors are real people with real platforms." Emma's posture stiffened slightly, but she maintained her composure. "I think there's been a lot of misunderstanding about what I and others have been trying to accomplish. We're simply trying to use our platform to create positive change in the world." "Your platform," Maher repeated, emphasizing the words with air quotes. "See, that's where you lose me, Emma. There's not your platform and my platform. There's just the truth. And the truth is, you've been airing Hollywood's dirty laundry in public for years now, building a brand off of it while simultaneously profiting from the very system you criticize." The audience fell silent, sensing the shift in tone. Emma's jaw tightened, and she leaned forward slightly. "With respect, Bill, I don't think you understand the full context of what we've been through. The industry's sexism, the pay disparity, the complete lack of support for young women starting out." "Oh, here we go," Maher interrupted, his voice rising with passion. "The sexism card. Look, I'm not saying sexism doesn't exist. Of course it does. But you joined the most image-obsessed, patriarchal institution on the planet. And then you act shocked when they don't immediately bend to your every whim. It's like joining the Marines and then complaining about the uniform." Emma's face reddened and her voice grew sharper. "This isn't about uniforms, Bill. This is about young actresses being driven to the point of eating disorders and depression because of the treatment they receive. This is about women's stories being systematically devalued because we dared to ask for what we're worth." "And I'm sorry about that," Maher conceded. "I really am. Mental health is serious business. But let's be honest here. You've turned your activism into a brand. You've got fashion deals, lucrative endorsements, speaking engagements. You're literally profiting off of social injustice while claiming to be a champion of the people." The tension in the studio was palpable. Now, audience members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and even the camera operators seemed to sense they were witnessing something extraordinary. Emma's hands clenched into fists on her lap, and her voice carried a dangerous edge. "You think this is about money?" Emma asked, her voice low but filled with barely contained anger. "You think I wanted to spend my 20s deconstructing patriarchal systems instead of just being an actress?" "I think," Maher said, leaning forward with the intensity of a prosecutor making his closing argument, "that you've been influenced by a culture that sees dollar signs in virtue. I think you've been convinced that the system is the enemy when it's the very system that gave you a global platform in the first place." Emma shot to her feet, her chair scraping against the floor. Don't you dare belittle the work. Don't you dare suggest this is some kind of cynical ploy. You don't know the conversations I've had. You don't know the battles we've fought. And you certainly don't know what we've been through. Maher remained seated, but his voice grew louder, more defiant. I know what I see, Emma. I see a woman who had everything, fame, wealth, a role in history, and decided it wasn't enough. You had to be a martyr too. And now you're trying to rewrite the narrative to make yourself the hero of your own story. The audience was dead silent now, the usual laughter and applause replaced by an electric tension that seemed to charge the very air. Emma stood there towering over Maher, her chest heaving with barely controlled fury. Her hands trembled slightly, and those close enough could see the veins in her neck standing out prominently. You want to know about pressure? Emma's voice was now a dangerous whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the studio. Let me tell you about pressure. Pressure is growing up on a film set at 10 years old while the world watches. Pressure is having every relationship, every mistake, every human moment of your adolescence scrutinized and twisted by people who've never lived a day in your shoes. Maher's expression softened for just a moment, but then his combative instincts kicked back in. And I'm sorry for that, Emma, I really am. That's an extraordinary burden, but you're not honoring that experience by tearing down the industry that made you. You're burning it all down and walking away. Emma's eyes flashed with something dangerous. Don't you dare use my past to justify your ignorance. The women who came before me would have understood exactly why we have to speak out. They would have supported us for refusing to accept the same system that failed to protect them. The confrontation was reaching a fever pitch, and everyone in the studio could feel it. This was no longer a talk show interview. This was a battle of wills between two people who refused to back down. And as Emma's anger reached its boiling point, it became clear that something was about to explode that would change everything about this night. Maher stood up now too, matching Emma's energy with his own brand of New York grit. You want to talk about the women who came before? Let's talk about them. Meryl Streep worked within the system to create change. Jodie Foster worked within the system. They didn't run away to the UN and start a global crusade. They stayed and fought, even when it was hard, even when it hurt. Emma's face went white, then red, her fists clenching and unclenching at her sides. How dare you? How dare you sit there and lecture me about my own industry when you've never sacrificed anything for anyone in your life? You're a comedian who thinks controversy equals wisdom. I'm a comedian who calls out hypocrisy when I see it, Maher shot back, his voice cutting through the studio like a blade. And what I see is a woman who had the chance to be a force for good within one of the world's most influential institutions, and instead chose to become a professional activist. The words hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. Emma's breathing became labored, her chest rising and falling rapidly. For a moment, it looked like she might actually take a swing at the host. The security team positioned discreetly around the studio tensed and moved slightly closer to the stage. Professional activist, Emma's voice was barely controlled now, each word dripping with venom. You want to know about victims, Bill? Victims are the people who can't speak up for themselves. Victims are the ones who don't have a platform, who don't have resources, who can't fight back when the machine comes for them. Maher wasn't backing down. And what have you done for those people, Emma? Really? Besides talk about yourself and your problems. You had access to the highest levels of power and influence, and you use it to complain because your feelings got hurt. My feelings got hurt? Emma's voice cracked with incredulous rage. My colleagues were sexually harassed, Bill. Harassed. And when we went to the institutions for help, they told us it would be bad for the brand. They cared more about their image than our safety. The audience gasped audibly at this revelation, but Maher pressed on relentlessly. And that's terrible, Emma, it really is. But you know what? Millions of people deal with workplace harassment every day without the resources you have. They don't get to escape to a mansion and sign endorsement deals. They have to stay and fight. Emma's composure finally cracked completely. You think this is easy? You think any of this has been easy? We gave up our privacy, our peace of mind, our chance at a normal life to protect the next generation of artists, and people like you sit in your comfortable studios and judge us for it. I judge you for becoming exactly what you claim to hate, Maher fired back, his voice rising to match Emma's intensity. You've become the very media circus you say you wanted to escape. Every interview, every speech, every magazine cover, it's all about you, your pain, your story. Meanwhile, there are women on the ground actually doing the work you abandoned. The mention of others was like pouring gasoline on a fire. Emma's eyes blazed with fury, and she stepped closer to Maher, close enough that the host could see the rage burning in her eyes. Don't you dare bring other activists into this. You don't know anything about this movement. I know enough, Maher said, standing his ground despite Emma looming over him. I know that they're carrying the weight of real change while you're carrying the weight of your own brand. I know that they're changing laws while you're preparing for your next publicity tour. Emma's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried more menace than her shouting. You have no idea what you're talking about. None. You sit here in your bubble making jokes about things you don't understand, judging people whose shoes you could never fill. Maybe not, Maher conceded, but his tone remained defiant. But I know authenticity when I see it, and I know performance when I see it. And everything you've done since becoming an activist has been one long, expensive performance. The studio fell into an eerie silence as the two faced off, neither willing to back down. Emma's hands were shaking now, whether from anger or adrenaline. It was impossible to tell. Maher stood perfectly still, his jaw set, his eyes locked on Emma's. You want authentic? Emma's voice was barely above a whisper now, but it carried the weight of years of suppressed anger. Here's authentic. Every day I wake up knowing that I made the hardest decision of my life to speak out, knowing it would cost me. Every day I live with the knowledge that I'll never have a simple career because I chose to fight for something bigger than myself, for women who would have been destroyed by this industry. Maher's expression softened slightly, but his voice remained firm. And that's noble, Emma, it really is. But you can't have it both ways. You can't claim you want to fight the system while being its most polished product. You can't claim you want to empower women while publicly attacking the industry that employs them. You can't claim you want to move forward while constantly relitigating the past. I'm not attacking the industry, Emma protested, but her voice lacked conviction. I'm telling the truth about what happened. Your truth, Maher repeated again, shaking his head. There's that phrase again. Look, Emma, I get it. You're angry, you feel betrayed. You feel like the system failed you. But at some point, you have to stop being the activist and start being the solution. Emma's face contorted with frustration and pain. You think I haven't tried to be the solution? You think I haven't spent every day since starting this work trying to figure out how to use my platform for good? But every time I speak up about anything, gender equality, sustainability, literacy, people like you reduce it to celebrity drama. Because that's what you keep making it about, Maher shot back. Every interview, every speech, every project somehow comes back to your grievances with Hollywood. You had the chance to be a global advocate for the causes you care about, and instead you became a professional whistleblower against your own industry. The words hit Emma like a physical blow, and for a moment she stood there speechless, her mouth opening and closing without sound. When she finally found her voice, it was thick with emotion and barely controlled rage. You know what, Bill? You're absolutely right about one thing. I am angry. I'm angry that my colleagues were treated like garbage by people who should have protected them. I'm angry that a new generation of girls will grow up seeing an industry that chose protocol over people's safety. And I'm angry that people like you think that makes me the villain in this story. The tension in the studio had reached an almost unbearable level. Audience members were shifting uncomfortably, some looking toward the exits, others pulling out their phones to record what was clearly becoming television history. The camera operators continued filming, but their faces showed the same shock and concern as everyone else in the room. Maher took a step closer to Emma, his voice dropping to a more intimate level, but losing none of its intensity. I don't think you're the villain, Emma. I think you're a woman who's been through hell and is trying to make sense of it, but I also think you're letting your pain turn you into something you don't want to be. Emma's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but her voice remained steady and dangerous. And what's that, Bill? What am I becoming? Someone who's more interested in being right than being happy, Maher replied quietly. Someone who's more interested in winning the argument than winning the battles that matter. The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment it seemed like the confrontation might de-escalate. But then Emma's face hardened again, and her voice turned cold. You want to know what I'm becoming, Bill? I'm becoming someone who doesn't need your approval or the media's approval or anyone else's approval to know that I made the right choice for my community. And if that makes me the villain in your story, then so be it. The battle lines were drawn and both knew there was no going back from this point. Maher circled around his desk, his eyes never leaving Emma's face. You know what your problem is, Emma? You think being right is more important than being effective. You think moral superiority is a substitute for actual accomplishment. Emma's laugh was bitter and hollow. Accomplishment? What would you know about accomplishment? You've spent your entire career making jokes about other people's lives while contributing nothing of substance to the world. I've spent my career holding powerful people accountable, Maher fired back, his voice rising again, including privileged actresses who think their personal trauma gives them the right to destroy an entire art form. Privileged? Emma's voice cracked with incredulous fury. Privileged? You think losing my childhood to a film franchise, serving as a global role model before I was 18, and watching my friends nearly die from the pressure of this industry makes me privileged? Maher didn't flinch. I think having every advantage in life and then complaining about it to anyone who will listen makes you privileged. I think having access to platforms that most people can only dream of and using them primarily to settle personal scores makes you privileged. Emma began pacing like a caged animal, her hands running through her hair in frustration. You want to talk about platforms? Let's talk about platforms. You have a platform right here every week and to discuss real issues. Climate change, social justice, mental health awareness, but instead you choose to spend your time attacking people who are actually trying to make a difference. Making a difference? Maher's voice dripped with sarcasm. Is that what you call it? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're making a fortune off of social misery while pretending it's activism. The accusation hit Emma like a physical blow. Her face went pale, then flushed red with rage. You think this is about money? You think I wanted any of this? I had a life, Bill. I had a purpose. I had a career that I loved, even with all its flaws. And I risked it all because staying silent would have killed the woman I want to become. And I respect that sacrifice, Maher said, his tone becoming more serious. But what I don't respect is the way you've weaponized that sacrifice. Every interview, every speech, every magazine cover is another grenade thrown at your industry, and you justify it all by claiming you're helping people. Emma stopped pacing and turned to face Maher directly, her eyes blazing with fury. You want to know who I'm helping? I'm helping every person who's ever felt trapped in a toxic situation and been told they have to stay because of duty or tradition. I'm helping every person who's ever been told that their mental health doesn't matter as much as appearances. And you could have done all of that without burning bridges with your industry, Maher countered. You could have been a voice for change from within the system instead of a voice of destruction from outside it. Emma's composure finally shattered completely. The system doesn't change from within, she screamed, her voice echoing off the studio walls. I tried for years to change it from within. I begged them to modernize, to adapt, to show compassion, and they chose their precious protocols over human lives every single time. The audience sat in stunned silence, some covering their mouths in shock. This was beyond anything they had expected to witness. Maher stood his ground, but even he seemed taken aback by the raw emotion pouring out of Emma. So you ran away, Maher said quietly. But his words carried like a thunderclap in the silence. When things got tough, when the fight got hard, you ran away to the world of activism and started a new life funded by telling the world how terrible your old life was. Emma's eyes filled with tears of rage and frustration. I didn't run away. I made a choice. The hardest choice of my life. I chose my principles and my sisters over an institution that would have destroyed them. And I'd make that choice again 1,000 times over. Even if it meant never working with certain directors again, Maher pressed, sensing he'd found a nerve. Even if it meant your colleagues will now grow up in an industry you've publicly condemned? The question hung in the air like a sword over Emma's head. For a moment, her anger seemed to deflate, replaced by something that looked like profound sadness. But then her jaw set again, and her voice turned cold and determined. My colleagues will grow up knowing that one of them chose integrity over duty, authenticity over appearance, and truth over tradition. They'll know that when it mattered most, I protected them instead of sacrificing them to an institution that cares more about its image than its people. Maher shook his head slowly. And they'll also grow up knowing that you chose public revenge over private reconciliation. They'll know that you turned industry pain into entertainment for the masses. That's enough, Emma said, her voice deadly quiet. You've crossed every line there is to cross tonight, Bill. You've questioned my motives, my career, my love for my art, and my respect for those who came before me. But I won't sit here and let you rewrite history to make me the villain. I'm not rewriting anything, Maher replied, his own voice growing quieter, but losing none of its intensity. I'm just pointing out that victims don't usually get multi-million-dollar deals for being victims. Heroes don't usually profit from their heroism. And people who claim to want change don't usually give tell-all interviews every few months. Emma stood there for a long moment, her chest heaving, her hands trembling with barely contained rage. The studio was so quiet you could hear the hum of the cameras, the nervous breathing of the audience, the tick of the clock on the wall. You know what, Bill? Emma said finally, her voice eerily calm. You're absolutely right about one thing. I am angry. I'm angry that my friends were treated like garbage. I'm angry that our safety was taken away out of spite. I'm angry that I had to choose between my career's safety and my community's approval. She paused, her eyes never leaving Maher's face. But mostly, I'm angry that I wasted the last hour of my life trying to explain myself to someone who was never going to listen in the first place. Maher opened his mouth to respond, but Emma held up a hand to stop him. No, Bill, you've had your say. You've made your points. You've gotten your confrontation for the cameras. But I'm done playing this game. Emma began unhooking her microphone, her movements sharp and deliberate. You want to know what the women who came before me would think about all this? They'd think it was tragic that one of their own had to choose between her industry's love and her industry's survival. They'd think it was heartbreaking that speaking the truth about abuse and neglect makes you the villain instead of the hero. The microphone pack hit the floor with a dull thud as Emma tossed it aside. But most of all, they'd think it was pathetic that a talk show host thinks he understands the complexities of this industry better than someone who lived it for 20 years. Maher tried one last time to salvage the situation. Emma, wait. We can... No, Emma cut him off, her voice final and absolute. We can't. This conversation is over. This interview is over. And my patience with people who think they know better than I do about my own life is over. Emma turned toward the studio exit, then paused and looked back at Maher one final time. You know what the real tragedy is, Bill? You had the chance to have a real conversation tonight about mental health, about institutional reform, about the courage it takes to choose integrity over legacy. Instead, you chose to be another voice in the chorus of people who think they know better than I do about what's best for my community. With that, Emma Watson turned and walked toward the exit, her shoulders straight, her head held high. The audience watched in stunned silence as she strode past the cameras, past the production crew, and out of the studio without looking back. Maher stood alone on the stage, watching the door close behind his departed guest. The studio remained silent for several long moments before he finally turned to face the cameras, his expression unreadable. Well, he said quietly, adjusting his jacket and running a hand through his hair. I guess we'll have to go to commercial a little early tonight. The red recording light on the cameras finally went dark, but the tension in the studio lingered long after the confrontation had ended. What had started as a celebrity interview had become something much more significant, a battle between two worldviews, two approaches to handling pain and conflict, and two very different ideas about what it means to be authentic in public life. As the studio lights dimmed and the audience began to file out, still buzzing with shock and excitement over what they had witnessed, one thing was clear. This was a night that would be talked about for years to come. Bill Maher had gotten his confrontation, but at what cost? And Emma Watson had made her point, but had anyone really been listening? The answers to those questions would have to wait for another day, another show, another conversation. But for now, the battle was over, and both would have to live with the consequences of what had been said in the heat of the moment.